Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that appears quite a bit in art, in video games. It's near and dear to very many alternative historians. It is a topic that is called Panzer 46, and the idea is had World War II, or rather in World War II in the European theater, got on for a couple of months longer or a year longer. Germany had all of these new designs like the E-series, the Maus, whatever, in its back pocket. And having put these wonderful new tanks into production, they could have turned the tide of the war, and then, well, who knows what could have happened next. So in this video, I'm going to take a look at what Germany actually had in their production plans for 1945, what they could have produced in 1946, and what, of course, the Allies could have also produced in that time to counter the new German designs. So let's start off with the E100. This idea started as quite an ambitious and interesting project. The idea was to make a tank that's the size of the Maus, so a super heavy tank, but you could do it with off-the-shelf components. So essentially, Tiger 2 parts could be used to build this huge tank. And this was actually quite an interesting idea. It was lighter than the Maus, obviously, because the Tiger 2, its drivetrain couldn't be pushed past its limits, obviously, but the front armor, the armament were comparable with that of the Maus, and so had it been completed successfully, it definitely would have been a very interesting project and a very powerful adversary on the battlefield. Now, the odds of this tank appearing on the battlefield in 1945, 1946, or even 1947 weren't just low, they were zero, because on July 10th, 1944, Hitler personally canceled work on all super heavy tank projects, and that includes the Maus and the E100. The partially assembled chassis was found by the British in May of 1945. They took it back to the UK, and in the 1950s, they scrapped it. And so there was no chance of the E100 ever being finished or put into mass production. And therefore, well, it's not going to show up in a prospective conflict of 1946 or at any point after that. So the E50 and the E75, the other two tanks of the E-series that are most often brought up in these scenarios, they're a very different story. They were designed as replacements for the Panther and the Tiger II, respectively, so the medium and heavy tank roles. And you see these designs in games like World of Tanks. They have these massive guns on them, like the 88mm L100, 105mm guns. Now, that is entirely a fabrication of video game developers, since the fortunate truth about the E50 and E75 is that the design was actually even less developed than the E100. There is no turret known to have been developed for these tanks. If it had been developed, well, all documentation about it is lost. We can sort of theorize what their armament would have looked like, because the Germans did actually try to fit an 88mm L71 gun, so not L100, same gun as on the King Tiger. They tried to fit it in a Panther tank, and it wouldn't fit. Similarly, they tried to put a 105mm gun into the turret of the King Tiger, but the conclusion was that this gun was just so bulky, the ammunition is so bulky, that at the very least it would have required the introduction of a second loader, the introduction of a separate propellant for the ammunition. It would have been a massive headache, and as a result, neither of these projects went forward. It's just, these guns were just too big for that class of chassis. And so it's incredibly unlikely that the E50 or E75 would have had a weapon more powerful than the Panther and the King Tiger already had. And like I said, by the time that Germany surrendered, these were still paper projects. They weren't even completed paper projects. And, well, it's possible that by the end of 1945, these tanks could have been completed, these designs could have been fleshed out, but it's also not guaranteed. Germany had canceled a very large number of prospective tank projects that had reached a very advanced stage at that point, including the aforementioned E100. So even if these tanks, the design had been completed, there's no guarantee that there would have been a prototype. And even if there was a prototype, there's no guarantee that the prototype would be put into mass production. So we can confidently cross off the E75, E50, and E100 from our Panzer 46 roster. Now, the interesting thing is we actually know what tanks Germany would have produced for the remainder of 1945 if they had the chance. This is through both interrogations of German staff and through inspection of captured documents. And you can see that the trend there is not to introduce all of these untested experimental new tanks, but actually to rationalize production to only a small number of different chassis, namely 3. You have your heavy tank, which was the King Tiger, and the complementary tank destroyer built on the same chassis, the Jagd Tiger. The medium class was filled by the Panther, and again, the Jagd Panther built on that chassis. Now, interestingly enough, the Jagd Panther was classified as a heavy tank destroyer. The Germans didn't have the concept of a medium tank destroyer, but it was built on the chassis of what they call a medium tank. Now, the light class is a little bit more interesting because you see in there the Jagd Panzer 38, the so-called Hetzer. But you also see something different. It's called Jagd Panzer 38D for Deutsch, German. And this is indeed a new vehicle produced in 1945. Well, I say new. It's a derivative of the Jagd Panzer 38 built in Czechoslovakia, or I guess at that point occupied Czechia. And it is redesigned a little bit. It is adapted to production in German factories. Some of the design flaws had been corrected, but this is a chassis of a light tank destroyer. This chassis would also have been used to build light reconnaissance tanks and light ARVs, but as you can see, the only new thing the Germans had to offer in 1945 is a universal light chassis, which is hardly turn the tide of the war type of project. Now we go to the Allies. A lot of these Panzer 46 projects, artwork, whatever, just kind of assume that, well, the Allies won't have anything new to offer, and so the Maus and U-100 and whatever will just effortlessly destroy everything in their path. That is actually not the case because the Allies had quite a number of new projects that had just hit the ground in 1945, and these projects, unlike the German ones, were available in metal and not on paper. First, we have, of course, the heavy tank T-26E3, standardized in March of 1945 as the M26 or Pershing tank. The Pershing actually had time to see combat in the Second World War and proved itself as more than an equal for the German Tiger tank. Now, 2,000 of the Pershing tanks would be completed by the end of the year, which is more than either all Tiger tanks over the entire production run or all Tiger II tanks over the entire production run, and actually almost as much as all Tiger tanks and Tiger II tanks put together that had been built during the Second World War. So as you can see, the Americans were building these things in great numbers, and those tanks would have been in Europe in the summer of 1945 in great numbers as well. Of course, the Americans also had all these heavy and super heavy tanks, the T-28, the T-30, the T-32. These are all prototypes. Maybe they would have been sent to Europe, maybe they wouldn't. But the Pershing, there's no theorizing about it. It was done, it was ready for battle, and it did see battle, in fact. So the Soviets were actually in an even better position. They didn't just have a couple of prototypes. The T-44 had entered mass production, and while the early tanks were not sent to the front lines, this was a very promising design. This was a medium tank, mind you, that was designed from the ground up to be able to take a frontal hit from the 88mm L-71 gun, so the type of gun used on the King Tiger and on the Ferdinand, which made it a very, very potent enemy against pretty much everything the Germans had on the front lines. Now, its armament was kind of lacking for 1945. The 85mm gun was incapable of defeating German tanks frontally, or rather German heavy tanks frontally, but then you get the T-54, and that was essentially a wider T-44 with a bigger turret that could accept a 100mm gun. So this was a 36-ton tank that had a gun and armor that made it able to fight a King Tiger more or less on equal terms, which, as far as wonder weapons go, pretty up there. And I mean, the T-54 and then the T-55, of course, the tanks that went into production during the Cold War were rather different than the one that was being tested in 1945. But this was a tremendously successful series of tanks that was in production for decades. So the T-54 was available in metal and could easily have been put into production by the end of the year. So that's another powerful weapon in the Soviet arsenal. Now, that's of course only a medium tank. There was another tank that was accepted into service in April of 1945, and that was the IS-3. And at a weight of just 46 tons, the IS-3 was pretty much invulnerable at anything but very close range to the 88mm L71 gun, even from the side. And of course, in return, it could knock out a King Tiger at great distances. And this tank, when it was introduced at the Victory Parade in 1945, triggered on its own an arms race because everybody had to have an IS-3 killer in their arsenal. And much like the Pershing, this tank was produced in very large numbers. 1,700 were available by the end of the year, which again is more than all Tiger tanks built ever. Kind of getting up there with outnumbering all of German heavy tanks. And given a couple of months in 1946, it would have caught up and surpassed Tiger II production as well. So again, a very powerful tank that was available in large numbers, that wasn't just tested or only available on paper. It was available in metal, and hundreds, thousands of them were completed. Now, the British are probably the weakest of the three, but even they had something interesting to offer because work began on a new generation tank, not a cruiser tank, not an infantry tank, but this was posed as a universal tank. And that project, of course, ended up being the Centurion. The Centurion, it had armor and armament probably comparable to that of the Panther, but nevertheless, it was a very good tank for its time. Like the T-54, it was the start of a very successful family of tanks that was in service and production for decades. And it just narrowly missed fighting in Europe in 1945. Centurion tanks were used in the summer during the occupation of Germany, but they just narrowly missed combat. So as you can see, all of the major Allied powers, the USSR, USA, and Great Britain, had powerful new tanks that they could put into battle that weren't available only on paper. They were available in metal, they were available in numbers, and they very narrowly missed the ability to see service in the Second World War. Meanwhile, the battered German tank industry had to focus on rationalizing its production. They could not afford to introduce new experimental designs. All they could do in 1945 is introduce a new universal light chassis, which is hardly a war-winning invention.